No pain, no gain. That was a sign posted in the high school wrestling room where my gym class would occasionally meet. And it was the first time I'd ever heard that particular expression, no pain, no gain. So I asked the gym teacher what it meant. And she told me that muscles grew when exercise caused small tears in muscles, that the muscles would heal by adding more cells, and that's how muscles would grow larger. No pain, no gain. Well, in seminary, I was one of the many students who worked with a therapist talking about our personal issues and how they could affect our ministry in the local church. One day I was talking about something particularly painful, and I shrugged my shoulders and said, "Oh well, no pain, no gain." Karen, my therapist, looked at me with a very flat expression and did this. I said, "What, you don't agree?" Well, the people listening to 1 Peter being read would have probably made gagging motions and sounds if they had been told there was no gain without pain, because they were in the midst of one of the most painful times in their lives. The people of 1 Peter were comprised of a very small, statistically insignificant group of Christians living in ghettos in the cities of Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. They weren't allowed to be citizens of these communities, therefore they had absolutely no rights under Roman law. Their neighbors did not like them, they did not trust them, so they had absolutely no business connections and generally were despised by everybody else in society. Even the other minorities looked at Christians and said, "You are the lowest of the low." Well, during the time of 1 Peter, Pliny, that's P-L-I-N-Y, Pliny was the Roman governor of the area. Now, Pliny broke with Roman practice and allowed the citizens of the communities to bring charges of blasphemy against Christians. Christians were considered blasphemy because they did not bow down to worship Caesar, they didn't participate in Roman armies, and thus they were breaking the law. So Pliny, who really didn't like Christians very much, allowed them to be arrested whenever charges were made. So Christians, when they were arrested, had the option of recanting, renouncing their faith, and worshiping Caesar, and thus losing all community because they'd be kicked out of the Christian church, and therefore have no one and nobody who would relate to them. Or they could choose to hold on to their faith, thus be imprisoned, possibly tortured, and very occasionally, very rarely put to death. So telling the people of 1 Peter that they would find gain through pain, I don't think was something that they would willingly embrace. In fact, I suspect they would tell us exactly what my therapist told me, and that is sometimes pain is just pain. Sometimes pain has absolutely no gain involved. Sometimes pain destroys people. Sometimes pain is nothing more than suffering. As we think about those who have suffered while wearing our nation's uniform, I suspect some of our veterans would agree that sometimes pain is just pain. Or if we talked to the families of those veterans who are living with brain injuries or post-traumatic stress disorder, I'm pretty sure they would agree that sometimes pain is just pain. If we talk to family members who had lost loved ones to suicide, or family members who live with chronic illness and chronic pain, I suspect they might reassure us that sometimes pain is just pain. Even so, even though we know that sometimes pain is just pain, the author of 1 Peter told the people listening that they should rejoice in the time of trial. Personally, I would have thrown things at him. And he went on to say that God notices our suffering. And then 1 Peter had the courage to justify pain and suffering by saying we suffer for one of three reasons. That suffering can be a test that strengthens our convictions about our faith. Or suffering gives us the opportunity to share in Jesus' story of suffering and eventual glory. Or we can suffer, and we can, by God's will and with trust in God, do as much good as we can in the midst of suffering. Personally, I don't find any of those justifications very helpful because sometimes, let's face it, pain and suffering are just pain and suffering. But 1 Peter begins with a basic premise, and that is the belief that faith in Jesus is no guarantee of a pain-free life. 1 Peter starts with the belief that followers of Jesus our Christ will experience pain and we will experience suffering. That faith in Jesus does not guarantee an always smooth, always happy, always wonderful life. In fact, if we look closely at the life of Jesus and his first followers, we discover that living our faith does not protect us from pain of any sort. We will become ill. We will experience accidents. We will experience mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual pain. We'll have times in our lives when it feels like God just doesn't like us very much because of all the pain and the suffering that is going on in our lives. Even so, 1 Peter wanted his listeners, and he wants us to know that pain can be redemptive. That means that pain can result in gain if we turn to God with humility and trust. That means we can grow closer to God, even in the midst of the hardest times of our lives, if we remember to ask God for help, if we ask God for comfort, if we ask God for strength and courage. We can grow closer to God when we remember we're not alone in this. That the more painful life becomes, the more we need God, and the more we need God's people to reach out to us and help us when life is hard and incredibly painful. I wonder if we all suffer from the same reaction to pain and suffering in life. We may think that we've done something wrong and therefore deserve some of the pain and suffering that we're experiencing. Or we may think of pain and suffering as signs of weakness and refuse to admit to God or anybody else that we need help. We may believe that we have to be strong enough to handle life all by ourselves, that no one should know when we're in pain, when we're suffering, when life is hard. And to those beliefs, 1 Peter, my therapist, and I say this. Because God walks with us through the good and the painful times of life, but we have to be willing to humble ourselves and admit how much we need God's help. God's people will walk with us through good and painful times of life, but we have to be willing to accept help. Financial, physical, emotional, and spiritual help. And for me, this is probably the most important. As people of God, as members of the congregation, we have to be willing to step up when we see somebody who's in pain. We have to be willing to step up when we see someone who is suffering. We have to be willing to step up and step over to someone when we know that their life is difficult and offer our assistance. We have to go out of our way to approach people and offer assistance rather than waiting for someone to call us, telling us what they need. I am so guilty of this. Maybe you are too. When somebody I know is going through a hard time, I say, call me if you need something. Who does that? Nobody. Which means we have to be the ones to make the gesture, and even the smallest gesture will let somebody know that they are not alone. Don Stannard Jr., who I worked with up in River Falls, the son of Don Stannard, the one from Wesley Church, told me the story of the day when their oldest son died. He was 4 years old, perfectly healthy, and one day he grew ill, laid down on the floor and died. Don and Ann were serving the church in Sturgeon Bay at the time, and they were a young couple. They had other kids, and they were absolutely devastated. The day of the funeral for their son, 2 men from the congregation came up on the steps of the parsonage and rang the doorbell. Don went to open it. He was the pastor. He had to face people. And one of the men said, "Bring me all the shoes from the family. I'm going to polish them." The other guy said, I'm going to take care of your car. I'm going to wash it. I'm going to clean the inside. It'll be ready to go for you. They spent a couple hours each polishing the shoes, taking care of the car, and then left without needing another word. Out of all the expressions of sympathy that Don and Ann received, those were the two that they remembered. When someone is in pain, when someone is suffering for a short time or even for a lifetime, all we have to do is offer the smallest acts of kindness. When we're suffering for a short time or long time, all we have to do is ask God and be willing to let the community of faith help us. And I think ultimately that's what, that's what 1 Peter wanted us to know, that everyone has times of suffering and pain, and we're not alone unless we choose to be. But when we allow others to help us, when we reach out to help others, we may discover that there is some gain, even in the midst of dramatic pain. Gain through pain, I don't know. When we refuse to open up to God, when we refuse to accept help from others, when we refuse to reach out to those in pain, then pain can be just pain. But there is a possibility for gain through pain when we remember that we are not alone. There are others who will walk with us. God is here to support us. We can remember there's a possibility for gain through pain when we take the courage, when we bolster our confidence and walk up to somebody and say, I'm going to do this for you. It may not be what they exactly need, but it's a gesture of kindness, saying that we care enough to do this. There's a possibility of gain through pain when we remember to include God and God's people in the experience. May we all discover that even when pain seems to be just pain, there's a possibility for gain. God, God's people, admitting we need help, and then reaching out to offer even the smallest gesture. That's gain. Amen.